this was originally a lightning talk, but I added a few slides, but it will probably be quite short. I haven't done it in a while, so bear with me if I have my phone to assist me here. I have some pointers, but let's just jump into it. So it might seem that there's something wrong with the title up here, but this is in fact one of the difficulties that you're going to run into as a developer if you're going to support languages like Arabic or Hebrew on your web pages. Any languages essentially that are read from right to left. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this talk now, but we'll get to this later. Allow me first to just do a brief introduction. My name is Tryggvi Gylfason. I'm a web developer working at Spotify out of the headquarters in Stockholm. And I'm working on the web clients team where we develop and maintain the web player and the desktop client. And I'm particularly interested in, at the moment, in accessibility and monitoring and product management and tech leadership. So if you like those things too, please, let's talk. I also am going to go to Loft Hostel later, so please join me if you want to go downtown afterwards. But let's get to the point. I see the screen is cropping off a bit there, but that's fine. So recently, Spotify launched in North Africa and West Asia regions, and one of the languages that's spoken there is Arabic, which is a language that's read from right to left. And this talk is based on a blog post that my team wrote, which is linked down there, and it kind of reads as a kind of list of pragmatic suggestions when you're implementing a right-to-left layout on your web page. It's basically just a list of lessons we learned and the problems we ran into and how we solved them. Okay, so here in the top left corner you see the web player in Hebrew, and in the bottom right corner you see the desktop client in Arabic. And that's how they look today, more or less. They've changed a bit, but not much. I mean, Spotify hasn't changed much lately. Okay, so before we go any further, I just want to expand some of the acronyms that I'm going to be using here. So RTL is a string, let's call it a string, that you're going to see pop up a bit in the presentation, and that stands for right to left. And conversely, LTR is a left to right. So just to clear up any kind of confusions about that. Okay, so you're going to support right to left layout. The first thing you have to do is you have to set the base direction of text on the page. And this is done through a HTML attribute that's called dir, a direction attribute. So if you want to support right to left, or you know that the user's preference is a right to left language like Arabic or Hebrew, then you will put the direction attribute on the HTML element, which will have this effect right here. So you have a paragraph in English that's right to left. So it's going to align everything in this paragraph tag to the right here. Sorry, I don't want to break your TV. And if you, this is the default, by the way. This is just like a regular paragraph in English. It's aligning here on the left instead of on the right. So that's the effect it has. But very quickly, you're going to run into a problem, because a lot of the CSS attributes that are kind of they have kind of an inherent direction baked into them, and this is for historical reasons, like margin left, text align right. You see the examples here at the bottom. So what can you do? You need to flip these attributes, essentially, or that's one way you can do it. You can use a tool like Post CSS RTL, which flips all these asymmetric CSS attributes automatically for you and generates the new CSS. And you can just plug this into your build process. See if I forgot anything here. Oh yeah, if you're using Flexbox or no, that's the next. Wait a second. Yes, if you're using Flexbox or Grid, those don't have any direction baked into them because these are newer standards which are aware of this problem. So, you know, flex start, flex end, it's just start and end, so the browser can choose for you where the end and start is. Okay. So let's say that we are using a tool like PostCSS RTL, and we have a class rule definition there in CSS in the input, and we have these 3 rules in there. We run it through PostCSS RTL or anything else, and it's going to separate out all the asymmetric attributes into these 2 new rules. So there's going to be one for left to right and one for right to left. And this is just targeting the closest element with a dir attribute there. And this, in case you're curious, this is just to keep the same level of specificity on the base rule. So in the future, and I'm super excited about this, someone should do a talk about that, we're going to get these things called logical properties in CSS that aim to essentially just fix this problem. So instead, in the future, instead of doing margin left, you're going to be using margin inline start. So there's going to be defined 2 axes. There's going to be the inline axis and the block axis. And you can, all the rules kind of are relative to these axes, and the browser can flip them whichever way you want. And it's going to support even other, it's called writing modes, the way you go, the kind of like the flow of text. And it's going to support like vertical writing mode, so you can have like a layout that goes from bottom to top or something like that. Yeah. Okay, so back to the title of the talk. That's the problem here. I'm going to try to explain this, and bear with me, it's a bit difficult to explain. But once you set the base direction of your page to be right to left, you're going to see things like this happening in places in your layout. And I'm going to try to explain why this happens. So the first thing you need to know is that every character in Unicode has a direction, or it has information about the direction it is, the context of where it's flowing, basically. So the letters of the English alphabet, they all have the left directionality. And for example, like these glyphs here in Arabic, I don't know what they're called, but they flow from right to left. And there are also symbols that don't have any direction baked into them, like the parentheses and punctuations and stuff like this. So what's happening here is there's an algorithm in the browsers called the Unicode bidirectional algorithm, which is applied to every text node when you have UTF-8, I think, as a character set on your browser. And it parses the string from right to left, and it encounters, let's start here, and it encounters the closing parenthesis here, and it sees this is a non-directional character, and the base direction of text on the page is right to left. So I'm going to flip it. And then it goes to the D, and it says, oh, this character is a left directional character, so I'm going to leave it alone. And it does that for all of the English characters until it reaches the opening parenthesis. And then it's going to say, okay, so the prevailing direction, the previous direction was left to right, or like was left. So I'm just going to keep that as well. So it keeps everything except the first parenthesis. Okay, and here's another problem. That's just the start of your problems. And they both have the same fix, and we'll get to that. But you'll get cutoffs at the beginning of sentences. So if you have the base direction as left to right, your Arabic sentences will cut off at the start, and if you have it as right to left, your English sentences will cut off at the start. So it feels like it's an impossible problem, right? You're just like stuck there. Ants of my heart instead of dance of my heart. So the fix here is to basically give a signal to the Unicode bidirectional algorithm, it's a mouthful, to make a trade-off. Basically, you tell it to make a more sophisticated and slightly more expensive pass over the text, and basically say, hey, there's dynamic content in there, we don't really know what it is, so please don't make too many assumptions. And that's how you do it. You set the direction to be auto. You're essentially saying, I don't know what it is, just figure it out, try to do your best. So, more issues we ran into. In Arabic, it's best to avoid serif fonts. Like the default fallback for Arabic in browsers is Arial, which we got feedback from users that it was very illegible. You can see the comparison here, it's quite hard to read. So we actually, we used, I think it's Noto, we used Google Noto first, but then we got our own font. At Spotify we have a font called Circular that we use. So that's, I think that's Circular. We also bumped the base font size up from 11 pixels to 12 pixels just to get it a bit more crisp and readable. Another problem is that the glyphs in Arabic can overlap. So using transparency in text colors, it doesn't really work. It's a cursive font, so all the characters are connected. So I don't know if you can see it here, but there's like a slight difference in the coloration here in the text. So what we needed to do is basically we avoided transparent text colors like RGBA or like anything like that as a whole, and we just used a completely opaque color and then lowered the opacity of the whole element, and that seemed to fix the problem. It might be considered as a browser bug, I don't know. Yeah, last issue is because the glyphs are taller than in, and this is not unique to right-to-left languages. This is if you're supporting, especially Taiwanese. It's infamous for being introducing this problem where the characters start to cut off on the line where you are, either at the top or at the bottom, because they're so tall. So you need to kind of just go in and try to find all those places. And there are more issues. So Arabic doesn't have the concept of capitalizations. There is no capital letters in Arabic, and Hebrew, I think, as well. Sorry if I think this talk is quite biased towards Arabic because that's kind of where the blog post was written from, but we support more languages now than Arabic. Anyway, it doesn't support letter spacing either because it's a cursive font. So you're basically ripping all the characters apart if you introduce any letter spacing, and it looks awful. So we had to remove all letter spacing in Arabic and all capitalization. Well, it doesn't really have any effect. So what you need to think about if you start using this is if you're using capitalization and letter spacing as we were doing to introduce hierarchies in the page or distinguish content, that's not going to have the same effect. So you can see here your library is quite distinguished from the members of the library, while here it just kind of blends in. So that's one thing to think about. Another thing is to think about is that Arabic uses a different delimiter for lists. So the comma in Arabic looks like that, while the English comma is like the regular comma. And we had quite a few places where we were joining strings with a comma like this. So we needed to change that, and we basically just picked the delimiter based on the language, but I know there's a better way to do it. I think you can use the list formatter API, which is part of the browser's internationalization APIs now, that can do this for you. List format, I think it's called. And there is also exceptions, of course. So this is kind of fun. You don't flip media controls. You don't flip playback progress. You don't flip volume sliders. And the reason for these exceptions, I think I dug this up on the internet. It's because people there, the users there, they got used to the layout and the arrangement of the audio hardware devices like VCR players and CD players and things like this in the 80s when they came around. So when they saw this on the web, they expected it to work the same way as the devices in their homes. So one thing we wanted to look at as well is how do we keep quality up in this experience? Because none of the developers on my team are going to be using the client and the right to left Arabic experience on a day-to-day basis. So how do we make sure that we don't degrade or break this experience for users? And there's a few options that we discussed. One thing we discussed was visual diffing. We didn't end up going down that route because they're quite expensive to implement and they can be quite a maintenance burden and are inherently more flaky than other solutions. So what we came up with was basically like a cheap thing. We built a little GitHub bot that nudges you just to check your experience in your PR. If you're introducing any of these asymmetric CSS attributes, either in CSS files or in JS files, it has these irregular expressions that it just parses your diff with and nudges you to check it out. You even have to like check a little checkbox. That's all. Thank you. Is there any? This is very distracting. Any questions?
What did you write the top of?
Node. Yeah, it was a Node script using the GitHub API. Yeah.
I noticed you never flipped the entire heading, so let it be, then you become if you let. If you not let that way in the right, is it just align to the right?
That's right. So if you have English content, they read it from left to right as well, because that's how English is structured. So if you would have mixed content in the sentence, for example, you would start reading from right to left, and then you would switch to the English part, and then go, yeah. Back there.
What is the difference between right to left, left to right, and text align right and text align left?
I guess text align is just overwriting the default. So if you are in right to left mode, everything is text align right, left, right by default. Yeah. Yeah.
Isn't that just the difference between sort of a visual indicator where you should start versus the way you actually see the test align thing? Would that be a way to explain it?
I'm not completely sure if it's just flipping it exactly like that, but if you're in right to left, it's gonna if you have a header, for example, that is a big box that takes the whole page, it's gonna start in the left part, right? If you're a website, if you put right to left, it's gonna go to the right part, even though it's English, right? So it's gonna kind of like align to the end of the header. Hope that explains it. Yeah.
So I noticed in some screenshots that parts of the Spotify player, which you're used to being on the left or the right, like the friend selecting tool or something.
Yeah, that's the first slide.
Yeah.
This one.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I guess that you would, how could you like, do you have different build for these types of right to left version of Spotify, or like are you using React to right to left and we try to do this, or what are you doing?
So yeah, thank you. Yeah, I've been forgetting to summarize all the questions so far. So the question was basically, do we have different builds or different files? Correct me if I'm wrong. For like the right to left experience and the left to right experience. So answer is no. We opted for this approach where we bake it into the same file right next to each other. So all the rules are in the same CSS file, and you just flip it with, you target the dir attribute basically on the HTML element. You could go for splitting it out into different CSS files if they get too big. Actually, something I forgot to mention is this is what we did on the desktop player, because we can bundle the assets. We don't have to fetch them over the network. On the web player, we actually do this manually to get less lines of code. Yeah.
Can you set some preference in the user agent? Like prefer score sheet? If you prefer with many players?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah. Is there some way to put preference in the user agent? So you always prefer right to left or left to right?
Yeah, I think, I mean, if, isn't it like the language? Yeah. The question was, if you can set a preference in the user agent or in some way to always pick the right to left language. So I guess, I mean, I guess you can, so we listen to like the navigator language on the web player, for example, which I think is based off the language header with the initial request, or whatever the header is called. And then we, serve the right translations, and we just save that preference for that user. Yep.
One question is not directly aimed at this left-right problem, but do you use any platforms or tools to manage the translations of all languages?
Yes. Yeah. Basically, are we using any provider or platform to handle all the translations at Spotify? Yes, we are using a vendor called Smartling to do this for us. Yeah. All right. Thank you. I think pizza's all right.